What questions do you have about either Reconstructionist Jews or secular Judaism, places where I need to clarify? If not, I want to move from talking about different types of Judaism. We'll eventually, in a few minutes, talk about Jewish practice, but before we get there, we do have to talk about a very important historical event within Judaism that had, or among Jews, but it had a profound effect on Judaism and Jews. The term Holocaust means something like burnt sacrifice. And it is one of the most important defining features of Judaism in the late 20th century, even into the early 21st century. Many Jews tend to prefer the term Shoah, which is a Hebrew word meaning calamity. The idea of a burnt sacrifice, still, it kind of suggests that the Jews were being offered to God through the Holocaust. And so the idea of calamity is more an idea that Jews prefer. It is, of course, the name given to the attempt by Nazi Germany to eliminate the Jews and other groups. Right? It wasn't just focused on Jews, but Jews were the predominant target of this during World War II. It's also important to recognize that the Jews were not enemy combatants in World War II, but were citizens of Germany and the German-controlled regions. They were marked for death simply because they existed. After the defeat of the Germans in World War I, they were humiliated on the world stage. They had lost the war. They had to then pay reparations, right? They had to pay money to a lot of these countries that they had damaged. And so that sent them into an economic depression. And instead of blaming the government, and instead of saying, right, this was an aggressive government, that's what caused our problem, many turned the Jews into scapegoats for Germany's defeat. They accused them of being lacking in patriotism, accused them of undermining the war effort, and particularly successful in turning this into something bigger was, of course, Adolf Hitler. The Nazi Party, in particular, rode this scapegoating of Jews into political power. And, of course, Hitler then made a variety of other aggressive attempts to gain what was called Lebensraum, or living space, and ended up drawing Europe into a second war. Additionally, there are other ways in which Nazi Germany or Hitler and others, kind of pushed these ideas, particularly promoting the idea of an international Jewish conspiracy. And the Treaty of Versailles that ended the war, hyperinflation that had taken place because of the economic situation, were all part of this conspiracy of Jews to take over Germany. Now, in the early years post-World War I, a lot of Germans had rejected those ideas. That cannot be true. But in the midst of an economic depression, those kind of things were more likely to be accepted. Nazis prevented Germans from shopping in Jewish stores. Shops were marked with a yellow Star of David to indicate that it was a Jewish shop and should not be patronized. Now, part of the reason, though not all of it, for choosing Jews as the scapegoat had to do with a millennia-long tradition of Christian anti-Semitism. Even back during the 4th century, when Christianity became the dominant religion of the Roman Empire, Christians in political power often expressed violence towards Jews because of the role of Jews in killing Jesus of Nazareth. This tradition continued for centuries into Western civilization. Jews were often blamed for any sort of misfortune. The Black Plague, for example, was looked upon by many Christians in medieval Europe as being the responsibility of Jews. Jews were poisoning wells, and that was what was causing people to get sick. Now, in many respects, we would say, well, that's not compatible with a lot of what's included in the Christian scriptures. Absolutely. But people that identified themselves as Christians did these things, and often persuaded other people that they should be punishing the Jews for killing Christ. Jews were stripped of their citizenship rights, their legal rights. Businesses and homes were taken. The Jews were herded into boxcars that took them to a system of death camps that either worked the Jews to death or actually killed them in specially designed gas chambers. Hitler's focus on the Jews was so unified that even toward the end of the war, when Germany was losing and soldiers and supplies were needed on the various fronts, trains were often diverted to take Jews to death camps rather than take the munitions and other things to the various fronts of Germany's war. Unfortunately, the world didn't recognize the extent of what was going on before it was too late for millions of Jews. During World War I, journalists had manufactured atrocity stories of what the Germans were doing to prisoners of war, to other citizens and other things. And so when the numbers started coming out of how many Jews were dying, many people believed that those numbers had to be exaggerated. They could not be true. When Berlin hosted the Olympics in the 1930s, the persecutions had stopped. So as world came to Berlin, they didn't see the persecution of Jews. And so those numbers couldn't be that large. At least that's what many people felt. And it was unfortunately not until almost the end of World War II that it became obvious the extent of what was going on. Furthermore, the opposition of many people in the United States towards Jews, as well as a variety of laws that were passed, prevented Jews from fleeing to the United States. Jews in particular were limited in their immigration. And that was also facilitated by the Great Depression and the limits that were placed on immigration during that time. 200,000 Jewish refugees did make it to the United States between 1933 and 1945. And other Jewish other Jewish people made it to places like Great Britain, but many more could have been saved. And because of this especially, the impact of the Holocaust on Judaism wasn't fully realized by Jews until almost the 1960s. When it did, as the news started making its way to the United States about the number of Jews murdered, a full third, at least, of the Jewish population at the time, it had a significant impact. In the 1960s, the Holocaust moved from being a peripheral issue to the center part of defining what it meant to be a Jew. Within the Jewish community, then, there have been a variety of ways of attempting to address the Shoah and what happened and what that means, especially in light of the ideas of the covenant between God and Israel. On the one end are responses like that of Richard Rubinstein, who said that God died at Auschwitz. Essentially an atheistic approach. Right? The Jewish story and the rituals needed to continue. But they should do it without God. There was no longer a way that God was important in Judaism. On the other end was the view of Emil Faulkner. God is still present in history, he said. And essentially, it's as if Jews had received a new commandment, a 614th. They cannot allow Judaism to die and give Hitler a posthumous victory. They must continue as a people. A third view, a kind of intermediate view, is represented in the writings of Elie Wiesel. It's kind of an ambiguous approach. The Jew, because of the Holocaust, has the ability to be angry with God. It is right to be angry with God, he said. You can even put God on trial. There is doubt, though. So there's, on the one hand, affirmation of Jewish values. On the other hand, there is this doubt. Instead of the Jews breaking the covenant, right, the history of Judaism being so much about the breaking of the Jews of the covenant, for Wiesel, God had broken the covenant at Auschwitz. Jewish history, he argued, is an endless quarrel between Jews and God, and that ultimately Jews must struggle for faith in the midst of doubt. Reflected in a passage from a very important work called Night. In the context of this, he is encouraged, right, he's a survivor of the camps, and so during his writing about his experience, he's encouraged to say the traditional prayers. But he finds himself unable to say the traditional prayers because of his bitter attitude toward God. Why should I bless him? Writes Wiesel. In every fiber I rebelled, because he had thousands of children burned in his pits, because he kept 6 crematoria working night and day on Sundays and feast days, because in his great might he had created Auschwitz, Birkenau, Muna, and so many factories of death. How could I say to him, "Blessed art thou, eternal, master of the universe, who chose us from among the races to be tortured day and night, to see our fathers, our mothers, our brothers end in the crematorium"? And so there's that struggle between faith and doubt. A fourth view is represented in the writings of someone like Irving Greenberg. Jewish history, he said, is, in the experience of Jews, is being tossed back and forth between stories of the Exodus and stories of the Holocaust. Right? And so there are moments where there are deliverance, right? The Exodus. There are moments of Holocaust. Right? And so there's back and forth between these. But one of the things that Greenberg said out of this is that ultimately, after Auschwitz, after the experience of the camps, Jews find themselves in a position where they cannot be required to embrace the covenant. But they do so freely in a wide variety of forms. And so Greenberg is allowing for diversity in Judaism. Right? So he's trying to encompass Judaism among its diversity. And so from the extreme Orthodox to the extreme secular, all Jews must accept each other as Jews. They cannot turn their backs on other Jews, no matter what the difference is. A fifth development was that of, and not a significant one, but a sizable one for Judaism in America, is the development of Jewish Buddhism. From the 1970s to the 1990s, anywhere from 6 to 30% of Americans associated with Buddhism were Jews. Jews had turned to Buddhism as a way to address the response of the Shoah. There are a couple of reasons for that, and since we haven't talked about Buddhism, I don't expect you to kind of expect this, but one of the major focuses within Buddhism is on suffering and its impact. And so dealing with suffering, trying to understand suffering. And so many Jews turn to Buddhism because of that. Buddhism, there are a lot of traditions within Buddhism that are non-theistic. And so Jews who had a lot of challenges with trying to say, well, how could God allow this to happen, turn to Buddhism to provide it with ceremony, with practices, but then also not have to focus on God. Questions or comments? Anything I need to clarify about these different responses?